address three themes of true freedom in God: the power of memory, the significance of right belief, and the role of responsibility. For the next 4 units or lessons, we are going to look at the power of memory. And 3 of these lessons come from the book of Ezra, and he is discussing rebuilding the temple and the experience of liberation because the Jews are leaving Babylonian captivity and going back to Israel. And then the 4th lesson is from the law of Moses, and where he reminds us of great blessings if we obey God's call on our lives. And we know that Moses wrote a chapter in Deuteronomy that if we follow God, we're blessed, and when we don't follow God, different things happen to us. So we will look at Ezra and one lesson from Moses in Deuteronomy. I titled our lesson, Rebuilding, Moving Forward. The first chapters, and this is on 234, the first chapters of Ezra tell a story of a grand reconstruction project in Israel. Memories alone would not complete the reconstruction project. Israel needed help from an unlikely source. The text of Ezra tells the story of the Jewish people during the 6th and the 5th century BC, where the Babylonian Empire had laid siege to Judah and destroyed Jerusalem. However, Babylonian rule was short-lived. And in 539 BC, the Persian King Cyrus destroys the Babylonian Empire, solidifying the Persian Empire's dominance in the region that will extend from what we consider modern-day Greece to modern-day India. So that was a big area. And in this, we're looking at today, it's called the Cyrus Cylinder. Never heard of it until I read this, but I did look at my Bible, and it calls it the same thing. So it's called the Cyrus Cylinder. And it details Cyrus's conquest of Babylon, and it culminates with the commandment to repatriate exiled people and rebuild their houses of worship. However, the prophecy's fulfillment did not necessitate the return of all exiles. Only the remnant will return. The rest of them will remain where they are. So we pick up our lesson today in chapter 1 of Ezra, and we'll begin with verse 1. And Renee, will you read verse 1?
Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying.
So we learn when, time period wise. It's important to know these things, and we know what. So in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, indicates now, since he had conquered him in 539, this is the year 538 BC. Cyrus's actions have been foretold by Jeremiah. Also, you learn this through 2nd Chronicles, in 2nd Chronicles. There's other places that you will learn about this, also in Ezra, besides Jeremiah. But it says, what is this proclamation? That's the key word right there. A proclamation was written or declared. So what is it? It came from Cyrus, and it was only because the Lord had anointed Cyrus as his tool for his will. That does not mean that Cyrus believes in our God. It means that God used Cyrus so that these Israelites could go home and rebuild the temple and take the things back to the temple, which we know is God's dwelling place, because God dwells in the temple. So that's important on this proclamation. So even though Cyrus proclaimed it or wrote it or had it written, he is led by God to do this. All right, verse 2, Pam.
Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdom of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah.
So while Cyrus recognized the role of the Lord in ordaining his leadership, he wanted to honor the many gods. So he's not just honoring our God, he's honoring the many gods of all the peoples that make up this land. That's throughout his empire. Ultimately, the exile's good fortune came from the gracious God who oversaw the political movement of all the kingdoms of the earth. We've talked about this before, but the title God of Heaven, combined with hath given me all kingdoms of the earth, recognize God's sovereignty as creator of both the heavens and the earth. So when you see God of heaven, usually you have the other phrase with it, and that's what that represents. While God is all powerful as creator, he is also active in his creation. We may not see it or think we see it, but he is still active in his creation. Cyrus proclaimed a new building plan, and he would help the exiles rebuild God's house, which is his temple, the Jerusalem temple that Solomon had built in Jerusalem, which was the political and the religious center of Israel. Everybody was supposed to go to Israel. That's what split the two kingdoms. They didn't want to come down and worship in Israel, and the northern kingdom built their own two places, and then they had golden calves there, and that got them in a lot of trouble, and that's why they went into Assyrian captivity. So, verse 3 and 4, Anita.
Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is the God, which is in Jerusalem. And whosoever remaineth in any place where he sojourneth, let the men of his place help him with silver, and with gold, and with goods, and with beasts, besides the freewill offering for the house of the God that is in Jerusalem.
The decree provided orders for the exiled people and oriented their perspective God. God had not abandoned them even in their captivity. God was in Jerusalem. Well, he's in Jerusalem, but he's also here today too. He was with them in captivity also. But in particular, when he says are in Jerusalem, we're talking about his presence being in the temple. And that's what they're telling you. It says, God in Jerusalem indicated that God was present with his people in a special way in Jerusalem, especially his temple, his house. And we know that when we read the Old Testament, for God to dwell there, he says he puts his name there. So God's name is in the temple, therefore God's presence is in the temple. Back in the wilderness, God's presence was with them, and they saw that visibly. They saw the cloud and the pillar of fire. So they saw God's presence that way. They don't see it that way in the temple. But God says, where I put my name, therefore that's where I will dwell. So that all ties that in. It goes on in this second verse 4. It gives you two interpretations that exist, because there's a key phrase in there that we don't really know who it refers to. And that phrase is the men of this place. One, they believe it was a non-Jewish individuals living in Persia. And two, it could have been Jews that had decided to return to Jerusalem. Point, it does not matter. Regardless of who these men were, these individuals were asked to help the returning exiles. That's your point. It doesn't matter if they was Jew or non-Jew and where they were living, they were asked to help. And you know, when you read this, they really, really do help. And they started helping right there. Look what they helped with. It was talking about silver and gold and goods and beasts and a free will offering, which will tie back in later on. So they provided, as I just said, silver and gold, goods, beasts, and a free will offering that would be used in the temple once it's rebuilt, once they return to Jerusalem. And therefore they could have proper worship back in the temple. Verse 5, Ashley.
Then rose up the chief of the fathers of Judea and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, with all of them whose spirit God had raised, to go up to build the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem.
Now, why did he specify in this verse Judah and Benjamin? Because those are the two nations that made up the southern kingdom. Those are the two nations that went into captivity with Babylon. When Nebuchadnezzar came into Jerusalem, those are the two tribes that lived there. The other 10 tribes were considered the northern kingdom, and they'd already gone into captivity. Besides, Jerusalem, when that area is where their land was, that was their inheritance. So when it talks about just these two, that's why it's those two. It was their land, it's where they lived. It goes on to say that that the Levites were with them in this verse. But the Levites were people that oversaw Israel's worship, the holy place, and the holy objects. Some might be priests, some may not be, but those priests came from the tribe of Levi, which was the Levites, because that was one of the sons of the 12 tribes of Israel. But they did oversee the temple, and they were the ones that could move the stuff. Remember when David wanted to bring the ark into the temple, and he did it the wrong way? Because you couldn't touch it. Remember the ark was going to fall, and one guy touched it and he died instantly because it had to be carried by poles, not on carts. So that was their job in moving the temple. Now other groups family members, they had a different job, maybe like packing the stuff when they were talking with the tabernacle. But they each had a particular thing that only the Levites could move it. And so they're important to this worship. While Cyrus issued a decree to rebuild the temple, and he does, he gives them this freedom to do this. We know it was ultimately God's plan for those whose spirit God had raised, stirred up in other words, would return to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. Verse 7 and 8, 6 and 7, Carol.
And all they that were about them strengthened their hands with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, and with beasts, and with precious things beside all that was willingly offered. Also Cyrus the king brought forth the vessels of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought forth out of Jerusalem, and had put them in the house of his gods.
So, unselfish support occurred. The people gave generously and willingly offered to the construction. And we see again, what all did they give? They gave with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, with beasts, and with precious things. They also, after being conquered, after he had conquered Babylon, Cyrus takes control of the royal treasury, and all of the utensils, the articles that was in the temple was stored in their temple. It was not melted down, so that will return with these returnees also, and that's what he's talking about here. These vessels of the house of the Lord, whatever they were held in the temple in Babylon, so they were in a safe place. We call that like a safe today because nobody's really going to rob a temple, and therefore Cyrus even gathers all the vessels and lets those go back to Jerusalem for the temple also. By concerning himself with the sacred artifacts of his subjects, it tells you that Cyrus was considered a very pious king. In other words, he was in tune to his people. That's why he had many gods. They could worship whoever they wanted to worship, so to speak. And this was throughout his empire. However, as our commentary tells us, his actions did not necessarily, I'm going to change the word, did not necessarily mean that he trusted our true God. God stirred him up and used him just like he stirred up Nebuchadnezzar, but then Nebuchadnezzar got really punished for what he did wrong because he had pride. But he stirred him up, and so therefore he does this. But it doesn't say at this point that he believed in God. And we know when you read Isaiah that he was even prophesied, I think, 150 years before he was going to be king. So because he's been in the plan all along, and you can read some of that on your own. But the key is God stirred him up so he would send the people back and send stuff with them. He didn't necessarily believe in God because he had many gods. We're going to jump down to verse 11.
11, you're not going to do
Nope, I'm not reading that one.
Okay. All the vessels of gold and of silver were 5,400. All these did
Sheshbazzar.
Whatever that is. Bring up with them of the captivity that were brought up from Babylon unto Jerusalem.
So it tells you here that the vessels were consisted of the utensils and the resources. They were made of gold and silver. And they give you this, because I don't know if you really, it says there was 5,400 pieces of gold and silver utensils. In other words, go home and count your forks or plates. You got 5,400 of these things you're going to take with you. So that way they give you that number to make it a little more to reflect the desire that they really want to go home. And then, as I said, that once they get home, they will store all of these valuables in the temple. It was considered a very safe place, and it was a place that really that you wouldn't want to rob your God of. So that's why the temples were considered like a safe place. That's where they kept their treasure. Okay? All right.
When the people gave them these things, were they still theirs, or were they given them to?
This is one, to me, this is the vessels and the utensils that Nebuchadnezzar had plundered out of the temple in the first place.
And they stay in the temple, they don't belong to the people.
No, they're in the temple. But this is what Nebuchadnezzar had taken, and so one good thing about that, he didn't melt, like I said, he didn't melt anything down, he kept it all. and he put it in some temple, cause it says it's in the royal treasury, so remember when, what's his name, Belshazzar got it and was drinking out of the cups in the temples and the goblets and so forth? Remember that story, the handwriting on the wall? Okay. So these will stay in the temple. I don't know what all the purposes were for all these things, but they would stay in the temple. Alright. We're gonna read from 64 through 67, Debbie. Now, listen to these numbers. She's gonna get you tongue-tied. Oh, you can read numbers.
The whole congregation together was 42,303 score, beside their servants and their maids, of whom there were 7,337. And there were among them 200 singing men and singing women. Their horses were 736. Their mules 245. Their camels 435. Their asses 6,720.
And then when we read the next two verses, we're going to find out how much they actually carried back. So that's why they needed all these beasts of burden, so to speak. Verses 64 through 67 make up the entire congregation. That is people. Okay? So we've got people, we've got animals, and we got things in these verses that we're going to talk about. To put it simple, that number she talks about, it is 42,360. If you want to know what a score is, it's 20. 3 times 20 is 60. That's how you get all these numbers. I wrote down that number because it's like it's hard to read that in 3 score. So it's 42,360. Alright, so this is a mass exodus. I mean, just picture this. This is a mass exodus. You got 42,000 plus people. That's just in this verse. Wait till you go down to 65. You're going to now have another 7,000 people. I don't know on that 200 singing men and women if that was 200 together or 200 of individual. You can do your own math on that. When I read it, I thought it was just together. Then I thought, no, that sounds like it might be 200 men and 200 women. I don't know. But when you add all those numbers up, you get about 7,700 people in addition to the 42,000 plus. So, this second chapter that Ezra begins listing all the family groups of the exiles that are returning. And aren't you glad we are not studying chapters, verses 1 through whatever, because all those names are listed in there. And I will let you go to those. That's why we skipped the other one. They highlighted 3 observations. This is what we want to look at. Okay. First off, the exiles formed family, the people of God. Okay, so family was important. The exiles preserved family relationships during this time. That's why they know who can go and work in the temple. They know exactly who has that job, who was a Levite, in other words. And the exiles returned to their homeland, and you get this in a sufficient number. I think 42,000 plus is sufficient. Okay? All right. That's not enough. In addition to these 42,360 exiles, we are going to add servants and maids and singing men and women. So when you add all these together, these Israelites and foreigners, and they were told to do that because Israel was called on to accept the strangers, that's the Gentiles, that's us, who love God and kept the Sabbath and adhered to God's covenant stipulations, so they were included in this going back. And like I said, when you get there, you get about 7,700 people. Well, if that's not enough, when you read the next 2 verses, we are going to take in about 8,000 animals. Now, you got 42,000, that's a long caravan. Wait till you add more people and all these animals. That's a lot. So, anyway. So, these 67 and 68, this details the number of animals that they're going to take. And the resources of the exiles needed for their return was surely a reminder of the original or the previous exile. Remember when they came out of Egypt, which was about 1 million people with all their animals and the other foreigners? So this kind of relates back to that. It's just not quite as big. But this also defines their relationship with God. So, regardless of who was in the group of returnees, it was large according to the numbers in these verses. Not only was the number of people enormous, the number of animals was also great. And if we add all these up, we will get over 58,000 people and animals in this caravan. And that's not counting the food you'd have to have for all these people. That's just the people and the animals. And then in 68 and 67, let's see what they're going to carry with them. This is why in 66 they needed some of these animals, because they need these beasts of burden to carry what we're going to read about in the next chapter. We'll see how, next verse. We'll see how much this amounted to. So 68 and 69, Lynn.
And some of the chief of the fathers, when they came to the house of the Lord, which is at Jerusalem, offered freely for the house of God to set it up in his place. They gave after their ability unto the treasurer of the work 61,000 drams of gold, and 5,000 pounds of silver, and 100 priests' garments.
So, these two verses tell us what they carried back with them. This is what they were taking back. The chief of the fathers took the responsibility to encourage their household to give toward the reconstruction. Now keep in mind, not only these were returning, but everybody back in Persia was contributors. It's just like we studied Job. Remember when Job got restored, everybody brought him gold and different things back? Remember that at the end where he had everything doubled? It's kind of like that idea. Alright, so then the people offered freely, and this is what they offered. They gave 61,000 drams of gold. I don't know what a dram is. I didn't think to look that up in the dictionary. I don't know if that's ounces, pounds, or what. But anyway, 61,000, so that's got to be pretty heavy. They gave 5,000 pounds. I can carry 50 pounds, so I know what 50 is. Can you imagine 5,000 pounds of silver? And then they gave 100 priests' garments. These were made of gold, fine linen, and precious stones, which were counted as part of the treasure. So all of this went into the treasury. All of this would go into the temple when they get it built, rebuilt back in Jerusalem. So you've got an enormous number of people, you've got an enormous number of animals, and look at what all they're carrying back. That's a lot of weight. Verse 70, Eva.
So the priests and the Levites and some of the people and the singers and the porters and the Nephilims dwelt in their cities, and all Israel in their cities.
So some of the people, namely the leaders of Israel's practices, would stay near the soon-to-be rebuilt temple, but others would begin to spread out back in the territory in Israel. So this week's lesson speaks of the exile's history. We're talking about memory. So they could remember the temple. That would be a memory. It was a powerful memory. But memories won't get it built. So God stirred up Cyrus, and Cyrus decrees that they can all go back. It's just like Cyrus decreed that Ezra could go back in the first place, because he was in captivity also. So we get this decree. So this is the exile's history, their promised return, their relationships, and even their economic needs. They do not go back empty-handed. They go back with all the money and building materials that they need at this point. While their return could have been disastrous, God provided directions through the decree that the Persian king, King Cyrus, had written. And it does, and they make it. I think it's probably about 4 months or so, but they make it safely. Rebuilding projects invite the participants to envision a new reality, something wholly different from what was before. And in those moments, we have to be available to God's provision and work, and we have to be available to God's leading. Cyrus was available to God's leading. He writes the decree. They can return. Those that got stirred up, they were available to God's leading, and they went home to rebuild the temple. And not just common laborers, but you had to have priests in order to carry on and make the yearly sacrifices. So they were, this group basically was available to God's provision, to God's work, and to God's leading.
Mindy, on page 235, that longing for home, did you see how ironic that story was about the comedian and the guitarist and their longing for home?
Yeah, I read that.
How fitting for today.
Talking about these, the Tartars, they were descendant of Crimea, and they had been sent away from Jerusalem, from their homelands, And we was talking about that they still remember, they hadn't experienced, cause some of them were born in captivity, and yet they wanted to go back home.
And bless their hearts today, they're fighting for home again.
Yeah, they are. But you know, if you look at that last paragraph, and I didn't pull it out, it didn't hit me, but since you brought it up, it says followers of Jesus experience a similar longing for home. So if you tie in that they're in exile, well, guess what? We're in exile too.
Absolutely.
And those that have gone home, they're no longer in exile. They are home. They have their inheritance. We can look at that one right there. They await today when the kingdom of God will be fully recognized over all creation. So some families have members that have received that, and we are still waiting today. And it says, while you may be a stranger in this world, remember where your true citizenship lies. That was a good point. I don't know why I wasn't, but that's a good way to end. We do have a citizenship somewhere else, and it's not on this world. Some have gone home. We may go home when he returns. We may go home before he returns. But we do have a heavenly home, an inheritance. And that's what this was all about in Ezra, about the inheritance, who had the land. And as long as they obeyed God, they lived in the land. They had their inheritance. When they disobeyed God, they lost. Joyce, will you close us in prayer?
God, we have seen our dreams shattered and our relationships lost. Restore us and give us courage to rebuild in your name, so that we can celebrate your grace. Lord, be with us the remainder of our service today. Give us a safe trip home and back again tonight to do your will, Lord. We just ask you that you forgive us of our many sins. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all.